John had been planning this hiking trip for months. He loved the mountains more than anything, and the thought of spending several days walking through untouched trails made his heart race with excitement. He had packed carefully, enough food, water, warm clothes, and even a small lantern in case he needed it. He enjoyed the solitude of nature. For John, being alone in the wilderness was not scary. It was freeing. It gave him time to think, to breathe, and to feel alive. The first 2 days had been perfect. The sun shone brightly, the birds sang in the trees, and the air smelled fresh and clean. He followed narrow paths along the cliffs, sometimes crossing little streams that sparkled in the sunlight. He even stopped to take pictures of rare wildflowers and birds he recognized from his guidebook. Everything seemed calm, peaceful, and exactly as he had hoped. But on the third day, the sky began to change. What had started as a few clouds in the distance quickly turned into thick, dark shapes that moved fast across the horizon. John felt a small chill, even though he was wearing his warm jacket. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway as if they were warning him to be careful. At first he tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a passing cloud. He had hiked through bad weather before, and he was confident he could handle it. As he climbed higher into the mountains, the clouds darkened even more. Soon, the sun disappeared entirely behind a gray wall of storm clouds. The wind became stronger, whipping his hair into his face and pushing against him as he walked. He pulled his jacket tighter and looked around for shelter. The path ahead was rocky and uneven, and rain began to fall in soft drops at first, then quickly turned into heavier sheets. The sound of raindrops hitting the rocks and trees grew louder, mixing with the howling wind in a way that made it hard to hear anything else. John knew he had to find a safe place quickly. He scanned the mountainside and spotted a small opening in the rocks. At first it looked like a crack, just a small hollow in the cliff. But as he ran closer, he realized it was a proper cave, big enough for him to squeeze inside. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from relief. He didn't know how long the storm would last, but at least here, he could be protected from the rain, the wind, and the cold. He ran toward the cave, slipping on wet stones, his hands brushing against the sharp edges of rocks. His clothes were soaked, and water dripped from his hair and jacket. Finally, he reached the cave entrance and ducked inside, taking a deep breath. Inside, it was dark and quiet, except for the sound of the storm outside. The rain hit the rocks with a steady rhythm, and the wind whistled through the trees above. But here, inside the cave, John felt safe for the first time in hours. He took off his wet jacket and hung it on a small rock, then set down his backpack. The cave smelled earthy with a hint of damp moss. The walls were rough, jagged, and covered in dark streaks where water had trickled down over the years. He could see small insects scuttling in the corners and a few bats hanging from the ceiling. Disturbed by the noise outside, John lit his small lantern, and the soft yellow light revealed more of the cave's interior. It was deeper than he expected, with twists and turns that disappeared into darkness. He could barely see the end, but he could feel the space around, him stretching farther than his eyes could reach. He found a spot near the back of the cave that seemed dry and flat enough to sit. The ground was covered in a thin layer of sand and small stones, and the walls curved around him like a protective shell. John sat down and took out some food, dried fruits and nuts, and started to eat, listening to the storm outside. The rain pounded harder now, drumming on the roof of the cave like a relentless rhythm. The wind howled, bending the trees outside and making the branches scrape against the rocks. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning lit up the sky in bright flashes, briefly illuminating the cave entrance before plunging it back into darkness. As he chewed slowly, John thought about how quickly the weather had changed. One moment, it had been a calm, sunny day, and the next he was hiding from a fierce storm in a dark, unknown cave. He felt a mix of excitement and unease. He loved adventures like this. But there was something different about this storm. It was larger, stronger, and more unpredictable than anything he had experienced before. The cave, which had seemed like a safe haven at first, now felt like a place full of shadows and unknown corners. He decided to explore the cave a little, just to see how far it went. Holding the lantern in front of him, he stepped carefully over rocks and small puddles. The walls of the cave were rough, and in some places narrow passages forced him to squeeze through carefully. The deeper he went, the darker it became, until the light from the entrance barely reached him. He noticed strange shapes in the shadows, rocks that looked like faces, small crevices that seemed to move in the corner of his eyes. His imagination began to play tricks on him, and he told himself to stay calm. John finally stopped at a small chamber within the cave. It was slightly larger than the area where he had first sat, with walls that curved around him and a ceiling that arched high. Above, water dripped slowly from the ceiling, forming tiny puddles on the ground. The sound of the storm outside seemed distant now, muffled by the thick rock around him. He leaned against the wall, feeling the cold stone against his back, and let himself relax for the first time since the storm had begun. He thought about how unpredictable nature could be. One day it could be calm and beautiful, and the next it could be dangerous and frightening. But that was part of the adventure. Part of why he loved exploring the mountains. He knew he was strong, careful, and prepared, and he trusted his instincts to guide him through this storm. Yet, as he sat there, listening to the water dripping and the wind howling outside, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. Something about this cave, something about the storm made the hairs on his neck stand up. He shook off the feeling and decided to eat more, rationing his supplies carefully. The storm would not last forever, he told himself. Soon the sun would return, the rain would stop, and he would continue his journey. But for now he was safe, hidden in the dark, dry cave. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to calm his mind and focus on the present. The storm was outside. He was inside. And for now, that was enough. Little did John know that the cave held more than just shelter. The darkness around him was not completely empty, and the storm was not the only thing waiting in the shadows. As the wind howled and the rain poured down, something else stirred in the depths of the cave. Something that had been waiting for a long time. John had escaped the storm, but he had unknowingly stepped into a place where the unexpected was about to happen, a place that would change this day and perhaps his life forever. John had been sitting quietly in the cave for what felt like hours. The storm outside raged on, and the sound of rain striking the rocks mixed with the occasional roll of thunder. He was starting to feel more comfortable, thinking about how he would continue his hike once the weather cleared. The cave was dark and deep, but it seemed empty and safe. His lantern flickered gently, casting long shadows across the walls. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears. At first, John thought it was just the storm echoing through the cave, a trick of the wind and water. But then he heard it again, clearer, this time. A soft, deliberate voice whispered, "My first fresh meal." John froze. His heart began to beat rapidly, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The voice was coming from somewhere deeper inside the cave, but he could not see anyone. He held his lantern high and turned slowly, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved at first. The cave walls were jagged and dark, and the corners were hidden in blackness. John tried to calm his racing mind. Maybe it was another hiker hiding from the storm like him. Or perhaps it was an animal that had made sounds that sounded like words. Either way, he needed to be careful. "Hello?" John called, softly, trying not to sound too loud or panicked. There was no reply, just the echo of his own voice bouncing off the walls. The silence made him uneasy. He felt the need to move closer to the source of the voice, but his instincts told him to stay where he was. Something about the tone of the whisper was strange. It was intelligent, deliberate, and almost curious. It did not sound aggressive, yet it carried a weight that John could not ignore. He took a slow step forward, then another. The cave was uneven underfoot, and water dripped from the ceiling, making small puddles on the ground. The light from his lantern flickered again, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with him. John's senses were alert. Every small sound, the drip of water, the rustle of a bat, the distant rumble of thunder, felt magnified. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Then he heard the whisper again, slightly closer this time. "My first fresh meal." The words were soft, but clear, almost as if the speaker was testing him, trying to see how he would react. John stopped moving and listened. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a lost child? He shook the thought quickly. No child would be in a cave like this alone. Maybe it was an animal, or even something stranger. He realized that the voice did not sound like any human he had ever heard, but it was not entirely animal-like either. Curiosity began to overcome his fear. John decided to move slowly and carefully, keeping the lantern high to see as far ahead as possible. Each step echoed in the cave, and he imagined that the sound would announce his presence to whoever, or whatever, was there. The shadows seemed to shift with each movement, and the cave felt larger, more mysterious, and somehow alive. The air smelled damp, but also carried a faint, unusual scent, something earthy and almost sweet, which John could not identify. As he went deeper, the whisper came again. "My first fresh meal." This time the voice was right at the edge of his hearing, almost beside him. John's hand instinctively went to his backpack, ready to use anything if needed for protection. His breathing was steady, but his mind was racing. What could it be? He could not see anyone. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, hiding corners and shadows that his lantern could barely illuminate. Suddenly he caught a movement in the corner of his eye, something small, crouching low to the ground, watching him. John froze. The figure was unlike any animal he had seen before. It was small and crouched, but its posture seemed intelligent, almost calculating. Its eyes reflected the light from his lantern, giving them an eerie glow. The creature did not move aggressively, but it did not retreat either. It watched him silently, with a sense of curiosity that made John feel both nervous and fascinated. John tried to speak softly, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it were listening. The whisper came again. "My first fresh meal." John realized it was not speaking aggressively. It seemed to be describing itself, or perhaps expressing hunger, but in a strange, unfamiliar way. He could sense intelligence behind the words, a mind trying to communicate despite the limitations of language. He decided to stay calm and cautious. John slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out some dried fruit. Holding it carefully in his hand, he extended it slightly toward the figure. The creature froze, watching the movement carefully. It did not rush or attack. It was cautious but not hostile. The words repeated softly, almost a whisper to itself. "My first fresh meal." John felt a strange mix of fear and fascination. He realized that this was not a typical encounter. The creature, whatever it was hungry, curious, and aware of him. John understood that showing aggression or fear would not help. He had to stay calm, patient, and observant. Slowly, he placed a piece of fruit on the ground near the creature. It moved closer, sniffing cautiously, then carefully took the food. John watched silently, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and wonder. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cave, a new tension had taken its place. The voice, the creature, and the shadows created an atmosphere that was both terrifying and fascinating. John had never experienced anything like this. He realized that the storm had brought him not only shelter but also this extraordinary encounter. The cave, which had seemed empty and safe, was now full of mystery. John remained still, observing the creature as it tasted the fruit. It made soft, almost human-like sounds, which could be interpreted as satisfaction or gratitude. The words echoed in his mind. "My first fresh meal." They were not a threat, but a declaration, a simple statement of existence. John felt a connection forming, an unspoken understanding that both of them were survivors in this harsh environment. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside began to subside slightly, and the rain softened. But John did not move toward the entrance. He was captivated by the creature, by the intelligence and curiosity he saw in its eyes. The cave, once a place of simple shelter, had become a place of discovery, a place where two beings, one human, one unknown, shared the same space and the same need for safety and sustenance. By the time the first hints of sunlight began to filter into the cave, John felt a mixture of awe and relief. He had survived the storm, but more importantly, he had witnessed something extraordinary. The creature had accepted his presence, and he had accepted its existence. The darkness of the cave was no longer just shadows. It was a world full of secrets waiting to be understood. John realized that the whisper, the voice in the dark, had changed everything. It had turned a simple escape from a storm into an encounter that he would never forget. The cave was no longer just a place of safety. It was a place where curiosity, patience, and courage had met something unknown and fascinating. And as he sat there watching the creature, he knew that this day, this storm, this cave, this mysterious being would stay with him forever. John could hardly believe what he was seeing. The creature in the cave was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was small, crouched low on the rocky floor, but its movements were deliberate and intelligent. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the lantern light, seemed to study him carefully. For a moment, John felt both fear and wonder. He had spent years hiking and exploring nature, but this was not just an animal or a wild creature. It seemed to possess awareness, curiosity, and even thought. He remained still, holding his lantern high and watching its every move. The creature had paused after eating the piece of fruit he had offered. It sniffed the air, then looked directly at him, as if assessing whether he could be trusted. John noticed that its posture was not aggressive but cautious. It moved slowly, carefully, and every step it took seemed intentional. He realized that this being, whatever it was trying to understand him, just as much as he was trying to understand it. John decided to speak softly. "It's okay. You don't need to be afraid." His voice echoed faintly in the cave, bouncing off the walls. The creature tilted its head, and for a brief moment John thought he saw a spark of recognition, almost as if it understood the words. It did not move closer yet, but it did not retreat either. The simple act of talking seemed to ease some tension in the space between them. He carefully set his backpack down and took out another piece of food. Slowly, he extended it toward the creature, keeping his hand steady. The creature watched the motion carefully, then moved closer in small, cautious steps. It sniffed the food and then, after a tense moment, took it gently in its small hands. John exhaled quietly, feeling a mix of relief and fascination. There was a strange intelligence in its movements, a sense that it was aware of the interaction, and making decisions deliberately. For the next few minutes, John observed the creature in silence. It seemed to be examining him in return. Its eyes followed his every movement, and he noticed small gestures, tiny shifts of weight, the flick of its head, subtle changes in posture that suggested it was more than just instinct. It was learning, assessing, and possibly even communicating in ways he could not yet understand. The whisper from earlier, "my first fresh meal," now made more sense. It was describing its experience, its hunger, and its interaction with him, all in the simplest way it could express. Curiosity began to overcome John's initial caution. He wanted to get a closer look, to understand this strange being better. He moved slowly, taking careful steps so as not to startle it. The creature did not flee. It watched him intently, waiting to see what he would do. John reached down gently and placed another piece of food closer to it. This time it accepted the offering more confidently, moving a little nearer to him. As he observed, John realized something remarkable. The creature seemed to be learning from him. When he made soft sounds, it responded with quiet noises of its own. When he moved slowly and carefully, it mirrored some of the gestures as if trying to communicate. John felt a sense of awe and respect. Here in the darkness of the cave, far from any human presence, he was witnessing an encounter that was rare, unique, and perhaps even profound. The creature began to move around the small chamber of the cave, exploring cautiously while keeping an eye on John. It touched the walls, sniffed small crevices, and occasionally glanced back at him, almost as if inviting him to follow. John realized that the cave itself had become part of the interaction. Every shadow, every rock, every small sound seemed to matter. He followed at a respectful distance, careful not to make sudden movements. Hours passed slowly. The storm outside continued intermittently, though it had softened considerably. Lightning occasionally flashed in the distance, illuminating the cave entrance and casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. John felt a sense of shared experience with the creature. They were both surviving in this environment, learning about each other, and navigating the unknown together. The cave, which had once been just a shelter from a storm, had become a space of connection and discovery. John began to speak more softly, narrating his actions and thoughts aloud. "I'm just trying to understand you," he said. "I don't want to hurt you. I just want to be friends." The creature seemed to respond to the tone of his voice rather than the words themselves. It crouched slightly lower, then straightened again, moving with caution but also curiosity. John realized that this being was capable of perceiving intentions, a level of awareness that surprised him. He decided to test whether it would respond to gestures. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed to a small puddle of water nearby. Creature watched, then moved toward the water, dipping its hands in and lifting them as if to drink. John smiled quietly. He was starting to understand that communication did not need words. Through observation, gestures, and simple offerings, a connection could form even between two very different beings. The creature began to explore more confidently, circling around John, sniffing at his clothes, and occasionally making soft noises. Each noise seemed deliberate, a form of expression that John could not fully understand but could sense. He realized that the creature was testing boundaries, learning, and adapting. This interaction was not just about survival, it was about awareness, curiosity, and the beginning of trust. As evening approached, the storm outside had mostly passed. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the wind no longer howled as fiercely. John felt a sense of relief, knowing he would soon be able to leave the cave. But he also felt a deep respect for the creature. In a few hours they had shared an extraordinary encounter, navigating fear, curiosity, and communication. The cave had become a space of learning, a stage for a silent dialogue between human and unknown being. John finally sat down again on a dry rock, observing the creature as it settled nearby. It seemed calmer now, less cautious, more aware of him as a presence it could tolerate and perhaps even trust. John knew that this encounter was rare. Most people would never experience anything like it in a lifetime. The creature had accepted him, and he had accepted it. For both of them, the cave had become a temporary home, a place where safety, curiosity, and understanding coexisted. He thought about the words it had whispered. "My first fresh meal." They were not threatening, not aggressive. They were simply a statement of being, a reflection of experience, and perhaps even a form of connection. John felt a quiet sense of wonder. The storm, the darkness, the cave, and this extraordinary being had come together to create a moment that he knew he would remember forever. Night fell completely, and the cave grew darker. John kept the lantern lit, its gentle glow revealing the creature's curious eyes and cautious movements. He felt a mix of fatigue and exhilaration. The storm had brought him here, but it had also brought him to something he could never have anticipated. A meeting with a being both mysterious and intelligent, a silent companion in the dark. For John, the cave was no longer just a shelter from a storm. It was a place of discovery, of understanding, and of shared experience. And as he sat quietly, watching the creature explore and interact with him, he knew that this encounter would stay with him forever, a reminder that the world still held mysteries, surprises, and extraordinary moments waiting to be discovered, even in the darkest places. John had spent the entire day observing the creature. By now, the initial fear had given way to curiosity and respect. He realized that the being was intelligent, cautious, and aware of him in a way that made their encounter feel extraordinary. The creature moved slowly around the cave, pausing at intervals to look at him, as if trying to understand more about who he was and why he had come into its home. John decided to take a small step to show that he meant no harm. He reached into his backpack and carefully took out a water bottle. Slowly, he poured a small stream onto a flat rock near the creature. The liquid splashed softly, and the creature jumped back slightly at first. Then it crouched low and cautiously approached the water. It dipped its small hands in and sipped carefully. John watched in fascination. The creature seemed to trust him enough to take what it needed, but it remained alert, ready to react if necessary. Encouraged by this small act of trust, John began to speak gently, narrating what he was doing. "I'm just going to sit here," he said softly. "You can come closer if you want. I won't hurt you." The creature tilted its head and made a soft noise that sounded like curiosity. Slowly, it moved closer, keeping its body low to the ground. John realized that even in the darkness of the cave, a silent understanding was forming between them. The fear that had once filled the space was replaced by a quiet connection. The creature explored more confidently now, moving around John in small circles. It sniffed his clothes, touched the edge of his backpack, and examined the lantern. John allowed it to investigate, understanding that this was its way of learning about him. He remained calm and patient, knowing that any sudden movements could break the fragile trust they had built. Every small gesture, every offering of food or water, was a conversation without words. John decided to try another small test of trust. He placed a piece of dried fruit on a flat rock a few feet away and then stepped back. The creature crouched low, observed the fruit, and then slowly approached. It picked up the food carefully and tasted it, then looked back at John as if to share the experience. John smiled quietly. He was starting to understand that communication did not need words. Observing each other, sharing food, and showing patience were all part of a growing bond. As the night progressed, John and the creature developed a rhythm. He would move slowly and speak softly, and the creature would respond with small gestures and noises. Each interaction deepened the connection. John realized that this being was not just responding instinctively, it was learning, adapting, and even showing signs of recognition. It remembered his gestures, the placement of food and water, and the tone of his voice. Every action mattered. The cave itself became part of this unspoken conversation. The shadows on the wall shifted with the flickering lantern light, and every drip of water from the ceiling created a quiet backdrop for their interaction. John felt a sense of wonder. The storm that had driven him into the cave seemed almost like a guide, bringing him to this moment of discovery. Outside, nature raged, but inside, there was a strange harmony between human and unknown being. At one point, John decided to sit cross-legged on the ground, letting the lantern light illuminate his face. He spoke softly. "I know this is strange for both of us, but I think we can understand each other even if we are different." The creature crouched near him, observing silently. It tilted its head and made a soft sound, almost like a question. John interpreted it as acknowledgement, a sign that it was willing to continue this silent dialogue. John reached slowly into his backpack and took out a few more pieces of food. He placed them in a small circle near the creature and then backed away slightly. The being approached carefully, picking up each piece one by one. After finishing the food, it paused and looked at John directly, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light. John felt a shiver of awe. The creature seemed to be expressing more than hunger. It was expressing curiosity, awareness, and perhaps even gratitude. Hours passed, but neither of them seemed to grow tired of the silent companionship. John spoke occasionally, narrating his actions and thoughts aloud. "I'm glad you're here with me. You don't have to be afraid." The creature made soft noises in response, tilting its head, moving closer, and sometimes mimicking small gestures. John realized that this being was capable of understanding more than he could explain. It was learning from him, and he was learning from it. By midnight, the storm outside had completely stopped. The rain had ceased, and the wind had calmed. The cave, once filled with the roar of the storm, was now quiet except for the soft drip of water and their gentle movements. John felt a deep sense of connection. He had come into this cave seeking shelter from nature's fury, but he had found something far more extraordinary, a companion in the dark, a being that challenged everything he thought he knew about life and intelligence. John leaned against a rock, exhausted but content. The creature settled near him, crouching low, and for a long time they simply existed together in silence. There was no need for words. The connection was unspoken but profound. John realized that trust had been earned through patience, calmness, and shared experiences. The creature, too, had shown courage by approaching him, accepting his presence, and engaging in this quiet interaction. As he drifted toward sleep, John felt a mixture of relief, excitement, and anticipation. The storm had brought him to the cave, but it had also brought him to this incredible encounter. He knew that tomorrow, when the sun rose and he left the cave, the memory of this night would remain with him forever. It had been a night of discovery, understanding, and connection, an experience that went beyond fear, curiosity, or survival. And in the deepest shadows of the cave, John sensed that the creature, too, had shared something remarkable. Their interaction had created a bridge between two very different beings. The words it had whispered earlier, "My first fresh meal," now felt like a symbol of their meeting, a phrase that marked the beginning of trust, awareness, and an extraordinary bond. In the darkness, the first rays of sunlight began to filter into the cave, illuminating the damp rocks and soft puddles of water. John stirred from his rest, stretching his legs and taking a deep breath. The storm had passed completely, leaving the mountains calm and peaceful. The air smelled fresh and clean, with a hint of the wet earth and moss. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that he could finally leave the cave safely, and sadness because he knew this encounter, so extraordinary, was likely a one-time event. The creature was still near him, crouched low and watching him with careful attention. It did not move away, nor did it approach aggressively. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the soft morning light, followed his every movement. John realized that despite the darkness and fear of the previous night, a deep understanding had formed between them. There was a silent agreement. Neither would harm the other, and both had found comfort in each other's presence. John decided to move slowly toward the entrance of the cave. He knew that the creature might be curious about his movements, and he wanted to maintain the trust they had built. As he walked, the creature followed at a distance, mirroring his careful steps. Each movement was deliberate, measured, and full of awareness. The cave, which had once felt dark, mysterious, and even frightening, now seemed like a shared space of trust and discovery. Outside, the mountains were quiet, bathed in golden sunlight. The storm had left the landscape refreshed, with droplets of water clinging to leaves and rocks sparkling in the morning light. John paused at the edge of the cave and looked back. The creature remained at the threshold, watching him. He realized that it had come to see him as a part of its experience, just as he had come to see it as part of his. Slowly, he took a small step closer and extended his hand in a gentle gesture. The creature tilted its head and made a soft noise, a sound that John interpreted as acknowledgement. He smiled quietly. He had no idea how to explain this being to anyone else, its appearance, its intelligence, and the way it had communicated without words. But that was not important. What mattered was the connection they had shared, the trust they had built in the darkness of the cave. John turned to leave the cave fully, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. The creature followed him a few steps into the sunlight, then paused. Its eyes seemed to convey curiosity and perhaps even a hint of farewell. John understood. It was time to let go. He whispered softly, "Thank you. Stay safe." The creature made a soft sound in response, then crouched low and disappeared slowly into the shadows of the rocks and trees beyond the cave. As John walked down the trail, the experience replayed in his mind. The storm, the cave, the whisper of my first fresh meal, and the strange intelligent creature had all combined to create a memory that he knew he would carry forever. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for his own survival, for the shelter of the cave, and for the extraordinary encounter with a being that had challenged everything he thought he knew about nature and life. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, calm and inviting. Birds sang in the trees and the sunlight danced on the leaves. John felt invigorated, alive, and humbled by what he had experienced. The world was full of mysteries, and sometimes, the most unexpected moments, the ones that happen in darkness, in storms, in places where few dare to go, hold the most extraordinary lessons. For John, that day had been more than a hike or an adventure. It had been a journey into the unknown, a lesson in patience, trust, and connection. The cave, once a place of fear and shelter, had become a place of discovery and understanding. The creature, though unseen by anyone else, had become a symbol of wonder and the unexpected magic that life sometimes offers. As he continued down the mountain trail, John felt a quiet smile on his face. He knew that he had been part of something rare, something that few people would ever experience. And somewhere in the wilderness, the creature he had met remained, a small, mysterious presence that had shared a night of trust and understanding. The memory of that night and the whisper of my first fresh meal would remain with him forever. A reminder that even in the darkest, most unexpected places, connection and wonder can be found.